Hi, and welcome to another edition of the NAIC Insight Series. I'm your host, Bob Greene, and I am delighted to be joined today by David Clunie, the Executive Director of the Black Economic Alliance. Welcome, David.
Hey, Bob, good to be on with you.
Um, David, you are our first guest in the political arena. I guess you could call Robert Rabin that, but he was really talking more in a financial services capacity. So this is a bit of a new frontier for us. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
I appreciate you having us here.
Absolutely. David, tell us, what is the Black Economic Alliance, and when was it formed and what's it focused on?
Sure. The Black Economic Alliance is a coalition of Black CEOs and executives and, aligned advocates and allies, all focused on building better infrastructure for Black wealth building. And that's with a particular focus on work, wages, and wealth, and on closing the Black-white racial wealth gap. The organization was formed in 2018 formally, but really came together out of a sense of necessity. They say necessity is the mother of all invention. And after the 2016 election, a number of folks who had been really influential in their own right, raising money for candidates, working on public policy, working in philanthropy as well, pulled together a meeting of about 80 of the who's who of Black executives, alongside folks like Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, Deval Patrick, Eric Holder, Susan Rice, and others, all with a view toward working collectively to have more of an impact on improving the trajectory of Black wealth building, and form the Black Economic Alliance at the time, with a focus on putting candidates in office who would represent our interest and who would prioritize improving work, wages, and wealth. And that's through our political action committee, and also through policy and issue advocacy through our 501c4. And then in 2019, we followed along with the formation of the BEA Foundation, that is really focused on programs in philanthropy, working really closely with private and corporate foundations.
That's outstanding. You know, when you think of the rich legacy that the African American community has around civil rights, around churches, not being involved in politics per se, but at least pushing the agenda to improve the quality of life of African Americans in this country, it's pretty extraordinary to think that the Black Economic Alliance has only been around since 2018, as you said. But clearly there's so much opportunity. There's so many things for you all to be focused on. What are some of the additional priorities? And let's go a deeper level in the things that you're focused on today.
Sure. So, I'll first say about the us only being a few years old. I think we just realized we hadn't had a critical mass of Black leadership represented on boards of directors, in corporate C-suites, and just at the senior level ranks in the private sector. And we still are woefully underrepresented, to be clear. But around the time of the formation of the organization, one of our Vernon Jordan, who was really kind of one of the fathers of the organization, and forefathers, I should say, blessed the formation of BEA by saying, we now have enough of a critical mass that we need to have a voice, and we need to use that platform to make sure we're improving opportunities and conditions for folks who don't sit in the rooms that we sit in. But what we're really focused on as an organization is building better infrastructure for wealth building, and that shows up a number of different ways. Obviously, I talked about through our political action committee, putting people in office who will prioritize our issues. And I think about one example of the CARES Act, the largest piece of legislation to ever pass in 2020, and trillions of dollars pumped into the U.S. economy. There were zero Black people in the room when that bill was being negotiated. There are, only a handful of Black senators, and none of them were in the room when it was being negotiated. And we think about, of course, we want to improve the representation of Black folks among our elected leaders, but we also need to improve and help educate the folks who are in rooms that we're not in, so that they can be champions for our issues as well, particularly talking about the net benefit to the entire U.S. economy of closing the wealth gap, the racial wealth gap, and fixing some of the structural problems in the Black economy. So, representation and putting folks in office who will represent our issues is a huge priority, especially as we lead into the 2022 election, as is Black economic and political power, making sure that Black folks place in our economy as well as our democracy is well represented, and that we are putting the tools in place to make sure that we have a necessary voice at the table in the way that decisions are made about our democracy as well as our economy. And then from a public policy perspective, there are a number of things that opportunities we have as a result of some of the legislation that's passed in recent years, the Inflation Reduction Act, the American Rescue Plan, et cetera. Again, trillions of dollars being pumped into the economy. A big focus of ours is making sure that we have a sharper focus than ever, not only on the short-term gains that Black folks could make in the way of business opportunity and procurement, generational wealth building opportunities for Black businesses to win contracts and scale their businesses, but also for us to change the way we do business with Black businesses. One of our advisory board members, John Rogers, talks all the time about changing from even the way we talk about supplier diversity to business diversity, so that we're being much broader and talking about not only contractors and construction companies and cleaning services, but also some of particularly the higher growth segments of the economy, like asset managers, lawyers, accountants, et cetera. So that's a big focus of ours, as well as business opportunity. Entrepreneurship is a big focus of ours as well right now, with two of our signature programs out of our foundation, the Center for Black Entrepreneurship and the BEA Entrepreneurs Fund, are both focused on facilitating the tools necessary to create more opportunities for Black folks to win investment in their businesses, as well as scale their businesses. So all of those things are just a few examples of the types of things that BEA is doing to build better infrastructure for Black folks to build wealth at scale.
This is powerful. I too have heard John Rogers talk about business diversity rather than supplier diversity. What's interesting is I'm going to go down a list of things that have been accomplished and kind of talk about the next wave of things, right? So we are all in Washington familiar with the 8A program, right? The program that requires the government to more broadly distribute opportunities to people of color. We are all familiar with supplier diversity programs and the work of the NMSDC, and shout out to them. This is their 50th anniversary. But a lot of that work came about through organizations like MBDA and the Commerce Department being willing to lean in and push for opportunities. I need look no further than the walls of the NAIC to see what has been done around access to capital. We have moved from, in the 70s, the MESBIC program, forward to today, where we have true private equity firms. What do you see on the horizon, David? What's the next set of rules, and where's the game going? Where's the opportunity set that you guys are helping us lay the groundwork for?
Yeah, and I think about the context for that being the moment we're in history, where there is just this really unique moment where we've had momentum like we've never had before around investment in Black communities, Black businesses, and as we talked about, coming out of the pandemic and the post-George Floyd era, there wasn't only a focus on racial equity, but a big focus, a narrow part of that focus on building wealth and putting in place better systems that help, Black folks build wealth. So I think we are focused on trying to capitalize on this unique moment in history to facilitate, systemic, sustainable growth. And we talked about Black business procurement. I think looking at the structural ways we can improve access to capital is a huge piece of this. Kudos to the Biden administration for not only putting people in place who will prioritize these issues, like Don Graves, the Deputy Secretary at Commerce, and Don Cravens, the first ever Undersecretary for Minority Business Development at the Department of Commerce, but also folks at the Small Business Administration. And I have the pleasure of sitting on the SBA Commission on Underserved Communities that John Rogers chairs under Administrator Guzman. And there's just a hyper focus on identifying gaps on getting access to capital, like the 8A, 7A programs at the Small Business Administration, but also taking lessons from the experience we had with the Paycheck Protection Program and some of the emergency relief that we know did not reach the folks that it needed to get to. So looking at, what are the systems we need to change to improve access to capital that Black businesses and Black communities have. And a lot of that, has to do with the financial institutions that we do business with, even things like credit reform. We really have to look at the mechanics and the structure of the systems that have dictated what kind of access we have or not to the financial system. And even thinking about, we've spent so much time talking about and investing in the last 2 years in minority depository institutions and even Black banks. There are all but just over 20 Black banks, and they have limited capacity. They can't take care of all the capacity in the entire Black community. So we need to be thinking about how we create institutions that better serve Black people, and that's where the BEA's work is focused on both public policy, private practice. You think about housing as an example of a place where really bad public policy over generations has created now a private system that, although the 1968 Fair Housing Act made on paper housing discrimination based on race illegal, we now have a larger ownership gap between Black and white homeowners now than we did when the act was passed in 1968. So there's a lot of work we have to do at the structural level to create institutions that are specifically targeted at including and leveling the playing field, particularly with respect to Black communities and Black businesses around the ability to build Black wealth.
So I'm, as you've seen in my prior interviews, I tend to ask questions that give the speaker the opportunity to go direct and specific. And I've learned being in meetings with you and through our conversations that you have no problem doing that. So I want to go through 3 areas to just understand where we sit and where we lie and what we're going to do about it. The first is, today, we know that there's a disparity between Black wealth and white wealth, but there's quite a significant disparity into the Black community in various wealth. Some folks have been pursuing wealth through education, through opportunity, through advancement for many, many years. And some people are still first generation attempting to assemble the building blocks. How does an organization like BEA serve the broader interests of the Black community and not simply the interests of a few wealthy elites, if you will?
It's a great question, and it's a question we get frequently, which is, are we working on behalf of the entire Black community or just the folks who have already achieved success, and we're trying to help them get from wealthy to ultra wealthy? And of course, the work we're doing is meant to improve conditions and opportunities for the entire Black community. And we look at a lot of the data around what it means to close the Black-white wealth gap in particular, and what that represents in terms of opportunity to the entire economy. So that's like the Citi report that was put out in 2020 that shows if we were to close the Black-white wealth gap, you could add $5 trillion to U.S. GDP in the space of 5 years. So all the work we're doing is aimed at improving opportunity for everybody, but we also are very focused on what we'd like to think of as the multiplier effect of creating wealth and scaling businesses and opportunities for Black folks who do well to reinvest in their communities, invest in other Black folks. And one example is on our board, Rich Dennis, who is the founder of Shea Moisture and the Sundial brand of companies, in an acquisition with Unilever. As part of the acquisition, created a $100 million venture capital fund to invest in Black entrepreneurs with a particular focus on Black women called the New Voices Fund. Through the New Voices Fund, they have created over 30 Black millionaires in just the last 2 years. And you think about the multiplier effect of what that means for these companies that will now hire Black workers, that will now invest in other Black businesses, that will act as both examples and mentors to other Black businesses, reinvest in Black communities. That's exactly the multiplier effect that we are trying to tap into. And we know some of the statistics around Black businesses. Over 95% of Black businesses are sole proprietorships. And that if you are to scale, when any business scales from 0 employees to even just 1 to 4, you go from an annual rate of return of right around $50,000, a little under $50,000 with no employees, to over $350,000 with even just 1 to 4 employees. So that's the kind of multiplier effect we're trying to tap into and help grow wealth at scale for the entire Black community.
So when you do anything as big and significant as you're talking about doing, which is growing wealth for an entire segment of the population, particularly a segment that has been systematically underserved, you have to have allies, right? And I want to name names, David, if you're willing to. who are our allies as a community here? Who are you finding traction in working with? We'll get to the obstructors later, but let's just talk about who are our allies. Who are the allies of the BEA and the Black community in this effort?
Sure. So let me start answering the question by saying we need everybody to do this work. No one entity, not even one sector can do it on their own. Not even government spending all of its resources can do it on its own. So we need the public, private, and nonprofit sectors working in concert, working collaboratively, finding efficiencies and opportunities to invest together and make broader impact. I'll say we've had success to date working in all sectors, public, private, and nonprofit, and to name a few, in each space. In the government, starting at the federal level, we have had a lot of success working with the Biden administration. No administration is perfect, but they have been very focused since making a racial equity commitment on day one on using the platform of the federal government and really having a whole of government approach to driving racial equity. And BEA has been laser focused on making sure that that focus touches down in the way of economic opportunity, not just social justice, which of course is important and has huge impacts on the ability to build wealth as well. But the same at the state and local level in the government. And you think about all the money that is flowing to states for contracts, for infrastructure, and other things. You have to have people at the executive level and all throughout the government that are making decisions about which communities that money is going to, how they're doing it in a way that is offsetting the historical trends of places like New York City, largest collection of Black people in America. Less than 2% of contracts from New York City before the current administration, before this year, were going to Black businesses. And we work with folks like Mayor Eric Adams, like Andre Dickens in Atlanta, and other folks who are really focused on trying to use their platforms, and even Frank Scott in Little Rock, Arkansas, the president of the African American Mayors Association, and his predecessor Sylvester Turner in Houston. They are focused on how they can use their platforms in concert with other sectors, to make sure this work touches down. But the private sector plays a huge role, private and nonprofit sectors. Nonprofit sector obviously are the Black-led organizations like the NAACP, the National Urban League, and even some of the newer organizations, have a real role to play. But I think the private sector has a huge, huge role to play here. And let me say private philanthropy, high net worth individuals, as well as private foundations. I think they're getting smarter about asking the questions of what Black organizations need. And I've appreciated that. One thing that I think has come out of the, as I call it again, post-George Floyd era of the past 2 years is paying more attention to the people who are leading the organizations they're giving money to, and also trying to give money in a way that is much more flexible to help particularly Black-led organizations scale and grow and do the work they need to without overburdening them administratively. And then in the private sector, there are the historic commitment of capital rhetorically to racial equity is a great start. Mm-hmm. However, I think the focus was on this arms race, as I call it, of trying to have the bigger number in 2020, yep. When it really should have been, and I think we're now starting to move in the right direction toward how companies use their unique set of resources and competencies to address structural inequities in our institutions that can actually help unlock and create more opportunity for Black folks economically. So, a couple of names I'll name. Bank of America was instrumental in helping us get off the ground. Our Center for Black Entrepreneurship with their anchor investment of $10 million. Folks like Wells Fargo, who gave us an anchor investment of $20 million in our BEA Entrepreneurs Fund to get off the ground. Folks like BlackRock, who have given $1 million toward a program that is not quite ready for prime time yet, but will help us drive better metrics and data around Black wealth once it is up and running. Folks like Cisco, Deloitte, et cetera, Capital One, and others. So everybody is on a journey, and BEA is really focused on partnering with the folks who are really committed to this work, but are also willing to put more than just their financial resources, but also have hard conversations, get outside of their comfort zone, and figure out how they can be part of the solution. But it really needs to be an all hands on deck approach. So I think we're just scratching the surface of getting folks around the table who need to be working together, and we look forward to continuing to build that coalition.
So I'm going to I'm gonna light the fire a little bit more, and hopefully I don't burn us both in doing this. But it's always fun to have one friend that plays with matches. David, we know that there are some structural alliances that the African American community has enjoyed over the years, at least since the civil rights era, right? I mean, there's one party that we tend to think of that gets us and that is interested in us. And there's another party that we oftentimes think ignores us, or even worse than ignoring us, works against us. But I learned something from one of my members, Bob Johnson. Bob Johnson said, Bob, no permanent enemies, just permanent interests. I want you to take those ingredients that I've just provided you and kind of expound a bit on how, if you're going to be successful, which will ultimately make all of us successful, how do we do this with both parties, given where the two parties start and their inherent ideological differences?
So I really appreciate that question, and it gives me an opportunity to note that BEA is intentionally a nonpartisan organization. The work that we do has to transcend the pendulum swing of which party is in power in the White House, and the House and the Senate, or any state house, or state governor's mansion at any given time. And it is really important that we have an understanding that transcends politics about the impact on our economy of getting this work right or getting it wrong. And not inaction is a choice as well, and is an action. So the way that we do this work is by being data driven, by identifying allies across the political spectrum. BEA was sure to, in our formation, get input from all across the political spectrum. We have folks who represent different political parties and political ideologies represented in our membership and on our advisory board and elsewhere in our organization. And it's really important that we have played a role. One example is in 2020, one of our biggest accomplishments was helping to draft, make input on, socialize, and then lobby and ultimately get passed a $12 billion bill to drive short-term immediate relief funding, as well as long-term investment to the community development financial institution and minority depository institution industry. And that bill that facilitated that process had 7 Republican and 7 Democratic co-sponsors on it. We worked with the Trump White House at the time to make sure that they had the right understanding of why this was important. And we worked with folks at the Treasury Department. We worked with folks on both sides of the aisle. And that kind of work has to continue. I do think it's challenging. We are at a time when our politics are divisive, and it is very hard to even get folks to the table on some issues. But BEA is determined to make our permanent interests in aligning with the folks who will drive our work forward. Of course, we don't do it blindly. We want people who will stand up for things that we believe in and that we can get behind. But this work has to transcend party. It's very challenging to do, but BEA is committed to continue doing that work. And I know we've had conversations with some folks in our community who just say, we give up. We give up trying to get folks to come into this work from all ends of the political spectrum. We're just going to work with the folks who are with us, and we know are with us. But I will agree that I don't think any political party, candidate, or corner of the political spectrum has the market cornered on improving Black wealth building and issues, for the Black community. And in fact, our history has shown us that parties end up in different places on some of these things. We think about the roles that the different parties played around the abolition of slavery, for example. So parties can change, people can change, our issues don't change. And I like Bob Johnson's perspective, and I think that's a good one for all of us as we identify the issues that are most important, that we align with the people, and we continue to align with the people who will help us achieve our goals.
So that was a wonderful answer. It was very accurate, and this wouldn't be NAIC Insights if I left it there. So I'm going to ask you names. When I look at the history of the NAIC, there were Republicans that were heavily involved and believed in the MESBIC program and the SBIC program, which were the core DNA that helped start at least our exposure to this industry. And one was Jack Kemp. Right. Jack Kemp was a friend of the NAIC's. He was someone that leaders in past generations could call upon. And he was a friend, even if every aspect of his politics didn't align with every interest that we have. Who are the friends of the Black Economic Alliance today that are on the Republican side?
So, we work with folks who are in office now and who are also out of office. Some of the folks who are out of office are people like Michael Steele, who is the first and only chair of the Republican National Committee. Folks like Steve Schmidt, who was John McCain's campaign manager when he ran for president in 2008, but has since left the party. But there are folks, who have been willing to engage on our issues. And let me say this: there is no one that, and this applies to our corporate sponsor or our corporate partners as well. There's no one that is perfect in their engagement with BEA, but I will say it's been a challenging environment to operate in, where because the parties things have been so partisan in the last few years, not just the 2 years of the Biden administration, but I think the last number of years. It has been challenging to identify folks who will always be on our side, and we've essentially had to go issue by issue and on a very subjective ad hoc basis, reach out to folks who would be willing to engage on particular issues. So it's something that is an ongoing set of engagement, and something that we look forward to bringing more folks onto our side or on our issues, and helping us make the case that fixing the structural damage in the Black economy and Black folks' access to the U.S. financial system is a net benefit to the entire U.S. economy. So that's something that we want to open the door for every Republican, Democrat, and Independent at any level of government to continue to work with us and make sure we achieve our goal, which is strengthening the sustainability and growth of the entire U.S. economy.
Good, good. So, David, as we've all learned from our fraternal and our civic organizations, there are three levels. There's local, there's state, and there's federal. And we can't fix the Black wealth gap nationally and leave major state and local communities behind. Right? There's no politician worth his salt that talks about cutting off communities, right? We actually want to engage more communities. And yet progress in this country has often been either as a result of the labor of our backs or built on our backs. If you look at the federal highway system and some of the communities that it bisected, those are historic African-American communities. I still wouldn't drink a glass of water in Flint, Michigan. Right. We have, whenever a natural disaster hits, people of color are severely impacted. And if there are Black people in those communities, they are, increasingly adversely impacted. How do you make the strategy and the impact go all the way to the ground, as opposed to, live somewhere at 5,000 or 10,000 feet, which would capture a lot of people, capture a lot of folks that are probably going to be supportive of you, but not really create the systemic core change that we want to see for our community?
Yeah, the two main drivers there, I think, are relationships and data. And on the relationship side, it's an ongoing 7-day-a-week process to continue to identify and cultivate relationships with the partners who are committed to this work and will be effective in putting their money where their mouth is, and their resources and priorities and efforts behind investing in interventions and solutions that help not only rectify structural damage of bad policy in the past, but also invest in real growth opportunities for their communities, with a particular eye on racial equity and creating opportunities for Black members of the community. And then on the data side, I think it is showing what is possible, showing both what's been lost as a result of not doing this work properly before, and missing opportunities to bring particular segments of your community in, and what a drag it is on an entire economy, be it local, regional, or national, to allow these problems to not only persist but deepen, and for divides to get deeper, and also what the business opportunity is if you're to fix some of these structural gaps in income and wages, and the racial wealth gap altogether, and what that means in terms of growth and sustainability opportunity for a particular community. So I think those numbers speak for themselves. And you think about, mayors like Maynard Jackson in Atlanta, and what they were able to do with a very unapologetic focus on investing in underserved communities, and what that has meant for generational wealth building for Black folks in Atlanta. There's such an opportunity to do the same at not only at the national and regional, but particularly the local level all around the country. And I would argue that you get more bang for your buck with investments both in kind of local politicians as well as local initiatives, when you're able to identify an acute need in a particular community and invest in, get the right people around the table to invest in it. So it is really important to do this work at all levels: federal, regional, state, and local as well.
So I'll get to an issue that is probably embedded in every African American in the country. And it starts early in our lives. We like to go places and see ourselves on the other side of the desk or on the other side of the counter. Mm-hmm. And we like to do business with us, right? So if you're at the registrar's office at an HBCU, you expect to be treated a certain way. Uh-huh. If you go into an African-American restaurant and you meet the owner or the chef, you expect to be treated a way. But we've learned, or at least come to realize, that not everybody that looks like us is willing to help us. That's a harsh, sad reality. What should Black folk expect of elected officials that look like us, of board members and major corporations that look like us, of corporate executives that look like us? Do those people owe us something? Should they be more lean forward and affirmative towards us? Or should we be more mature and nuanced in our thinking about them?
That is a really good question. I have not heard put in those terms before. And I think it's a question we as a community need to continue to ask ourselves. And my answer is, I think we need to hold everyone to a high standard, and everyone owes us something. Mm-hmm. So whether they come from our community or not, we have to be holding them to a standard of performance and priority on our issues, that we can't simply look at somebody's background and say, oh, well, they went to an HBCU and they are Black, so they're going to look out for our issues, or vice versa. Because they didn't go to a particular school, or they don't come from the Black community or community of color, that they won't look out for our issues. I think it is our job to impress upon the people who are in positions to create and facilitate opportunities for Black folks, for Black businesses, for wealth building, for us to give them the tools necessary to help them help us, if you will. But I think we absolutely should have high expectations of everyone, and it is, I will admit, more disappointing when there are folks who there's the term all skin folk ain't kinfolk. It is more disappointing because I think we do default to expecting that there will be a higher level of priority and attention placed by Black people on working on behalf of Black people. But unfortunately, that's not always the case. So I think we have to look for those allies everywhere that that we can find them. We should continue to increase representation. I do think it is true that when you put people in positions of decision-making authority and power to make decisions about where resources will go, you increase the chances that those resources will go to places maybe they've had a hard time getting before. And I think about, again, John Rogers as an example of the boards he sits on at McDonald's and University of Chicago. After he joins them, all of a sudden they are, becoming leaders in business diversity, and also the work that we've done at the Black Economic Alliance to put help place two, and NAIC was extremely supportive in this effort, help place two Federal Reserve governors on the board of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. There have only been 3 in U.S. history, in 808-year history of the Federal Reserve. Those are people who are making decisions about banking policy, about what full employment looks like, about monetary policy, and we need more folks who have the lived and professional experience to understand why these things are important, but also who have shown a commitment throughout their career to prioritize these issues and are willing to take a meeting with and hear from our communities and our organizations and make sure that they prioritize our issues, regardless of what they look like.
No, you're so right. And look, you can't go to a Black church in late October and early November without seeing somebody, right, whether it's a Black person or a white person or an Asian person or Latino, asking us for something, right? Nobody has a problem asking the African American community for their vote, for their support. They're happy to put it in a language that they think we like, right? They may quote a hip hop artist or an entertainer. I've even seen elected officials dance in pulpits, right? I mean, whatever it takes to get a vote.
Preaching, all kind of fun stuff.
No question about it. But as you know, there's a certain cynicism that our people carry with that, because we won't see them again until it's re-election time again. And so I want to ask you what I get the big strokes, right? I understand what BEA is going to do in a lot of different arenas relative to policy and thinking and the high-minded things. What are you guys prepared to do around accountability, right? If you think about the NRA, if you think about other organizations that hold political power and hold people accountable for political power, they'll print out your voting record, right? They'll give you a letter grade, right? They'll tell other people what that is. What has BEA discussed, thought about, or committed to hold people accountable for our agenda?
Yeah, that's one of the big objectives of the Black Economic Alliance, is to make sure that engagement with the Black community, particularly Black voters, happens throughout the entire tenure of someone's time in office, not only in the 2 to 4 weeks leading up to an election. And the work that we've done on that front is providing financial and political support up front, but also on the back end to the folks who have shown up for us. Just like you said, people have no problem coming to us, so we make asks as well of the people who who we have endorsed and get behind. And there are certain things that they have to do to win and keep our endorsements, such as one of the top staffers on a campaign, as well as in someone's office once they get elected, has to be a person of color, particularly a Black person. And there's so few Black folks represented among chiefs of staff, for example, on Capitol Hill. They also have to commit to push, sponsor, and support certain legislation around closing the racial wealth gap and improving economic opportunities for Black folks. And those are things that they have to do in the, whether it's 2, 4, 6 years in between our endorsement and re-endorsement conversations. But also we engage on a regular basis after an election, making sure that we are partnering on legislation and partnering on priorities. So, one example is Stephen Horsford, who has been a multiple times endorsed candidate of the Black Economic Alliance out of Nevada, including Las Vegas and some other parts of the state. Sits on the House Ways and Means Committee and has been a co-chair alongside Terry Sewell of the Racial Equity Initiative on the House Ways and Means Committee, trying to use the tax code to create economic opportunity. And we are in very regular, early and often contact with his office about what our priorities are, and even trying to add nuance in places where there are things that they need to better understand, like how the carried interest exception impacts folks in the investment space, particularly Black folks who are just starting to build wealth, and who are impacted in a way that would impede on the ability for us to build wealth and reinvest in other Black businesses. So it is really an ongoing set of engagement. But we make it very clear on the front end when we engage with folks that this is not, a blank check. We are not going to give you a rubber stamp seal of approval. We engage with a view toward the long term and making sure that there's a very regular system of checks and balances on, where their performance at any given time is against our priorities.
Do you think that's something or some aspect of it that you would ever publish or make available to the diaspora?
We haven't contemplated it to date, but that's I hear you that it has been effective, and I've seen other organizations effectively put out report cards and other statements around where folks fall on their issues and how well they have or have not performed. So that's something I'll certainly take back to our leadership and see if it makes sense for us to do in the future.
So I'm going to put a bit of a caveat in the section I'm about to go into. The Congressional Black Caucus has been the bastion of support in good times and bad for the African American community. I say that without equivocation. The people who sit there live and breathe not only for the people in their district, but more broadly for what they see as the dominant need of their people in the African American community.
Mhm.
However, there have been times when, to your earlier point of politics making strange bedfellows, that I have observed members of the caucus to be not focused on the economic policies that will help as much as they might be for social policies that they will help,
Mhm.
or not focused on creating sustainable change economically, but one-time hits.
Right.
If you agree with me, and I don't know if you do or you don't, would you pick up the conversation from there, talk about what you've seen, and talk about how we ameliorate some of those situations and circumstances?
Yeah, and I'll say this. I think our representatives in Congress, the Congressional Black Caucus, continues to grow, which is a great thing, and we need more and better representation. More being the number, and better being the, I think, level of sophistication on our issues where we need to be leaning in. We need all of it, all the above. And when you think about the industries that have driven wealth building around financial services, and a lot of economic issues, we are, as Black folks, significantly underrepresented in all of them. So it's not a surprise that a number of our representatives in Congress are not deep, and do not have a deep level of experience on financial issues, and that is some of them. Some folks are extremely impressive in their experience with, understanding of, and engagement in economic issues. But I think that's a place where organizations like ours, particularly the Black Economic Alliance, have a real role to play, providing information that is meant to be helpful and meant to help facilitate good policy making that is data driven, that addresses needs, and helping to put in perspective what some of these things mean. So I think we can do a couple of things going forward. One is increasing the number of representatives among the Congressional Black Caucus who come from industries that have more exposure to and experience with economic issues, but also playing a role as supporter, facilitator, and even educator from the outside, providing the right sets of information, resources, and even partnerships with organizations that do really good work around policy and research and data, to make sure that our representatives in Congress, who, you're absolutely right, every member of the Congressional Black Caucus that I know of individually, and especially as a body, they really look out for the entire Black community, regardless of which congressional district they may happen to represent. So I think we have a vested interest in making sure they have the information, data, and tools they need to get us the resources we need to be successful, particularly economically.
No, I think that's so vital. And it brings me really to my next question, which is, when you think about a Black economic agenda, right? When you
Mhm.
think about actually, let me say it differently. When you think about a Black political agenda,
Mhm.
the aspiration to use politics to improve the quality of life for Black people in this country, wealth isn't immediately the first one that the broader diaspora would talk about, right?
Right.
HBCUs are perennially high on the list of things that we want help and support for. Housing, not necessarily from a wealth generation standpoint, but from a basic sustenance standpoint, is
Mhm.
high on the list. Education, we learned during COVID that broadband is problematic, right? Because of our lack of access to it. How do you create a lane in such a crowded field, David? And some of these issues, people have been leaning in on them for years. There's a lot of attention and appetite consumed around them, but yet you have an important mission too. How do you, as a leader, how do you create space and visibility and a lane for yourself and your issue and your organization?
And this is a place where this makes the case for why the Black Economic Alliance was necessary. It is to have an ongoing and regular laser focus on the importance and necessity of economic policies that will create better opportunities for us. I would argue that that doesn't have to be at the expense of the social justice agenda. I think it is a complement and a necessary facilitator of the social justice agenda. So any one of those issues you mentioned, whether it's police community relations, criminal justice reform, housing, social welfare assistance. All of those things have a financial component, and all of those things impact the ability of Black folks to build wealth. And our orientation as the Black Economic Alliance is to highlight the opportunity to drive better wealth building for our entire or growth for our entire economy if we're able to create pathways for the folks who are represented on the lower end of the economic spectrum and the socioeconomic spectrum to lift up and to essentially maximize the potential of more folks in our economy. So it doesn't have to be an either or calculation. It is a both and it's really having this economic focus be complementary and additive to what is already a robust social justice agenda. But we know from experience that there really have not been organizations laser focused on economic issues. I will say organizations like the National Urban League have been focused on economic empowerment, but I know by virtue of their scale and their history of being one of the oldest civil rights organizations in America, alongside the NAACP, they have to have a wide spectrum in the issues that they're addressing. So the BEA really has the advantage of being able to focus 100% of our efforts on economic issues, and it's a really important focus that we need to make sure is in all conversations, or that we are trying to inject in all conversations about racial equity, social justice, and as you said, a Black political agenda has to prioritize and move up on the priority list economic issues. And I would argue that there is an economic angle to every one of the issues that is already on the Black political agenda. What we're trying to do at BEA is work with our partners, and in addition to our partners at other Black-led organizations and allies, to make sure that those issues are a higher priority, and that resources, when they're being allocated, whether it's by Congress at the state level or even private and philanthropic organizations, are realizing the economic opportunity and are allocating their resources accordingly.
I'm going to ask you a thin question and let you build on it, because it is going to be a ripe area for discussion. You mentioned the uniqueness of this moment in time. You mentioned it with sort of a tingle of, frankly, optimism. As I take from that, two names come to mind: Don Graves and Don Cravens. Can you talk about what it means to BEA and the broader African-American wealth building movement to have those two individuals with their backgrounds in the role that they sit in today?
Great question, and I'll give the start broad and get narrow on the Dons. On the broader point, a big part of the infrastructure that BEA talks about in wealth building is having, as we talked about, people who have the right lived and professional experience to make decisions that will improve economic opportunity, particularly work, wages, and wealth for Black Americans. That is, across the government, we have not had enough representation, particularly in key economic roles, not only of Black folks, but of people who understand the net benefit to the U.S. economy of focusing on these issues and fixing the structural damage. So, we have a unique opportunity with an administration like the Biden administration that has been focused on, putting in place the most diverse, not only cabinet in history, but administration in history. And I think we need to continue to build on that, because the bar has been set too low. It's been too easy to say we have a first here, a first there, a first, and it's, one is not enough. We need to create pipelines and legacies. But Don Graves and Don Cravens in particular. Don Graves, I had the pleasure of working with him at the Obama Treasury Department, but this is a brother who has the background of focusing on, when he was at the Treasury Department previously, was overseeing the Office of Small Business Community Development, and he was the person who oversaw the CDFI fund, the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund. So was focused on underserved, disinvested, low-income communities and how to use the resources of the government to lift them up. And throughout his career has been in the public and private sector, was at KeyBank doing corporate responsibility and engagement with underserved communities, but using the resources of a large bank to do it, and has been a close economic policy advisor of Joe Biden throughout his career. So to now have him as the number 2 at the Commerce Department, overseeing everything from international trade to procurement to issues of intellectual property and of course minority business development. It is just transformational to have him, one, with the proximity he has to the President of the United States, but also the purview of having a bird's eye view and responsibility over the entirety of one of the largest departments of government, and steering those resources to places where they're needed. And then Don Cravens, who has had a storied career both as a local politician. He comes out of Louisiana and has been a state legislator, and then was leading the National Urban League's Washington Bureau. So he was their head public policy advocate in DC, and he went into the private sector as well. Worked in the communication space, and then went back to the Urban League and was working in a capacity around, he was the COO, but also working around ESG issues, environmental, social, and governance issues. And to have him as the first ever undersecretary, moving up the position from the director of an office to the undersecretary of the department, overseeing minority business development, those bodies of experience just bring a whole different level of capacity, depth, and experience to real resources that are being disseminated on behalf of the United States government. We need way more people in office like them who bring that kind of body of experience in the public, private, and nonprofit spaces, and even civil rights spaces, making the decisions about who's going to get opportunities, how we're going to right historical wrongs of the past at the federal policy level, the state policy level, and really create opportunities that we've never had folks in the federal government creating, particularly for communities of color in the past.
I totally agree with that. And I think that their combination of expertise and ambition around the agenda will really, I think we'll look back on this time period and see that we shortened the length of time from conceptualization to implementation because we had the right people in leadership to do it. I only have a couple more questions for you, David, and we'll give you an opportunity to really drive home the message. When you think about the we both are inner city, so we're gonna get some sound.
Exactly, we get a little bit of Harlem in the background. Sorry about that.
Absolutely, it could have been DC as well. When you think about the organizations like NAIC that are largely focused on capital, right? Mm-hmm. What should, I'll give you the opportunity to put me on blast. What should NAIC be doing with BEA, and what can BEA do for the NAIC community?
Yeah, I think it's good for us to hold each other accountable because there's so much opportunity for us to be, again, maximizing on this moment we're in history. But you think about the investment industry of just $70+ trillion of capital flowing around. We know, I'm sure you probably can't get through one of these insights without citing the statistic that over 98% of that capital is managed by white men. And so, less than 2% of that capital is managed by the collection of people of color, women. It's a crazy statistic. And you think about, how much wealth generation there's been in the investment industry, particularly in private equity and other spaces in the alternative investments. So our responsibility, I think, is to look for opportunities together. BEA on the advocacy side can use our engagement with and relationships with, public policy leaders and decision makers, to help drive the priorities and agenda of creating more opportunities that, the work that NAIC and NMSDC and others do on a daily basis, making sure that is at least on the radar, if not a priority of the people that we engage with. And we know it is, but they need to understand that we are working in concert. And something that we hear often from our partners in government and in the private sector is that they wish there would be more collaboration among organizations like ours and Black-led organizations, so that we are speaking from, singing from the same hymnal, and that we are coordinating on where the real opportunities are. So I think what's incumbent on both of us to do is continue to coordinate early and often, and make sure that as we both have agendas, that they are aligned, and that we're looking for opportunities to be efficient and more impactful when we're coordinating our asks, our engagement with different folks, and that they hear us with each other's the name of each other's organizations in each other's mouths as we talk about what we're working on with NAIC. You talk about what you're working on with BEA, and the more they hear it, I think the more we increase the opportunity and the possibility that some of our asks will actually be acted upon.
Absolutely. You have my word. I'm committed to it. Let me give you the final question. And the final question is, what should every member of the African American community know about BEA, think about BEA, and do in alignment with BEA?
So what folks should know about BEA is that we are a relatively new organization, but that we want to make sure that the work we're doing is sustainable over a long period of time. So we need, partnership and support of a wide swath of people to do that. We represent Black business leaders, but it is Black business leaders using the access and the platforms they have, particularly on boards of directors and C-suites, and in concert in our work with leaders in the public, private, and nonprofit spaces, to advocate on behalf of the entire community. So we want to make sure, that we're hearing from folks in the community, and that we are partnering with the right folks. So to the extent you are aware of public, private, nonprofit actors, both entities and individuals that we should be aligned with, please do reach out to us. You can find out more at blackeconomicalliance.org. You can follow us on any of our social media platforms, on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, but get in contact with us, and we will continue to look to align ourselves with the people who are best positioned to help us achieve our goals, and that is folks who represent leadership across industries, but also folks who are plugged into and understand the needs of our community. So we want to be hearing from folks across the board about what we need to be focused on, and make sure we're partnering so that capital drives the work that we do. We need financial support, but we need intellectual capital as well, and making sure that we have the best information possible as we advocate on behalf of the economic improvement of our entire community.
Outstanding. David, I want to thank you for joining me today, for spending some time, for sharing your intellect and your insights, pun intended. But moreover, I want to thank you for your leadership. What you and your board have set out to do has been needed for a long time. And I, as one of the leaders of an incumbent organization in this space, welcome you, welcome the agenda that you're pursuing, look forward to collaborating with you. And most importantly, I look forward to someday looking back and realizing that the work that we did together changed the arc of ascent for our people. So thank you, David. And I look forward to seeing you down the road.
Thank you, Bob. And let me say the same for NAIC. The work you do is so important. I appreciate your leadership and really appreciate your partnership, and really look forward to what we'll be able to do together. So
outstanding. Be well, my brother. I'll see you soon.
You as well. Thanks.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye.